The Walls That Spoke to Gods, Karnak's Sound Laser Mystery. If you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It truly helps the channel grow and continue to create contents like this. There's a moment when you first stand inside the Great Hypostyle Hall at Karnak, where logic kind of steps aside. You're surrounded by stone columns so massive they feel less like architecture and more like geography. Forests of carved sandstone rising up, blocking the sky, swallowing sound. And that's where this story really begins, because Karnak isn't just something you look at. It's something you experience with your body, especially with your ears. And once you start paying attention to that, the idea of the so-called Karnak sound laser walls doesn't feel as crazy as it sounds at first. Most people walk through Karnak thinking about scale, how big it is, how long it must have taken, how many pharaohs added to it over centuries. But very few people stop and think about how the place behaves acoustically. What happens when sound moves through it? Because sound doesn't just echo here. It channels, it narrows, it focuses. In certain corridors and between certain walls, your voice travels in ways that feel unnatural, like it's being guided along invisible rails. Now imagine this place thousands of years ago. No crowds, no planes overhead, no modern noise. Just wind, footsteps, chanting, maybe drums. When someone spoke or sang or invoked a god, that sound didn't dissipate randomly. It interacted with stone that had been positioned with extreme precision. Walls aligned on cardinal directions, corridors forming long, straight pathways, massive flat surfaces facing each other at distances that weren't arbitrary. That's where the idea of sound behaving almost like a laser comes from. Not light, obviously, but focused vibration. There are modern experiments that show sound can be directed, shaped, even weaponized. But the unsettling part is realizing that ancient builders may have understood this intuitively. Not with equations, not with instruments, but through experience. Trial, error, ritual. If you build something, chant in it, and notice that your voice carries farther here than there. You remember that. You replicate it. Over generations, that becomes tradition, design language, sacred geometry that isn't about numbers on a page, but about what the human body feels when it vibrates with sound. At Karnak, certain walls are so long and straight that when you stand at one end and speak, your voice travels down the corridor with almost no loss. People have reported whispering to someone hundreds of feet away who can hear them clearly. That's not magic, that's physics. But physics that feels magical when you're not expecting it, especially if you're living in a world where gods are real, present, and responsive. Now layer ritual onto that. Picture a priest standing in one chamber, unseen by the crowd, speaking or chanting. The sound travels down a narrow corridor, emerges seemingly from the stone itself in another space. To the listener, the wall is speaking. The god is speaking. Authority without a visible source. That's powerful. That's not deception in the modern sense. That's sacred theater. A way to collapse the distance between human and divine. The term sound laser walls sounds modern, almost sci-fi, but the underlying idea is ancient. Controlled sound as a tool. Not just for communication, but for emotional impact. Fear, awe, reverence. When sound is focused, it doesn't just reach your ears, it hits your chest, your stomach, your nervous system. Low frequencies especially can induce unease or calm, depending on context. Ancient people didn't need EEG machines to know that. They felt it. What really messes with people is the consistency. Karnak wasn't built in one go. It evolved over more than 1,000 years. Different rulers, different styles, different political climates, and yet certain alignments and acoustic behaviors persist. That suggests knowledge was preserved, passed down, maybe orally, maybe through apprenticeship, maybe through ritual itself. The builders might not have said, "We are creating an acoustic corridor." They might have said, "This is where the god's voice travels." And then there's the sheer mass of the walls, thick enough to block external noise almost completely. Step inside certain sections, and the outside world disappears. That silence makes any sound inside feel amplified, significant. A footstep becomes a statement. A chant becomes a presence. When you combine silence with focused acoustics, you create an environment where sound equals meaning. There's also the question of directionality. Some corridors seem to carry sound better in one direction than the other. Speak from point A to point B, it's clear. Reverse it, and the sound diffuses. That asymmetry is fascinating. Whether intentional or emergent, it would have been noticed. And once noticed, it could be ritualized. Certain people speak, others listen. Certain paths are for voices, others are for silence. Now zoom out and think about why Karnak existed in the first place. It wasn't a temple in the way we think of churches today. It was a cosmic machine, a representation of the universe, the gods, creation itself. Every axis mattered, east to west, north to south. Light, shadow, precession, timing. Sound fits perfectly into that worldview. Vibration was life, speech was creation. In Egyptian mythology, the world itself comes into being through spoken word. So of course sound would be sacred. The idea that walls could guide that sound isn't a stretch. It's almost inevitable. If the universe was spoken into existence, then temples should be places where speech is powerful, where words don't just communicate, but enact, where vibration reshapes reality, even if only psychologically. There are also accounts of people feeling disoriented in certain parts of Karnak, even today. That could be heat, scale, expectation, or it could be subtle acoustic effects interacting with the inner ear. Low-frequency resonance can mess with balance and perception. Again, you don't need to understand the mechanism to exploit the effect. You just need to know that when you stand here and chant, people feel something. And here's the part that makes modern minds uncomfortable. If ancient builders understood how to manipulate sound using stone, even roughly, then they possessed a form of knowledge we don't usually credit them with. Not advanced technology, but advanced sensitivity. They paid attention. They observed how environments affect humans. They built accordingly. We tend to assume progress moves in one direction, that we know more now. In some ways, that's true, but in others we've lost something. We build fast. We build cheap. We isolate function from feeling. Karnak was the opposite. It was slow. It was deliberate. And it was designed to make you feel small in the presence of something larger. The laser idea isn't about beams slicing through space. It's about focus, about intentionality, about reducing chaos and amplifying meaning. A spoken word that doesn't scatter, but arrives intact. That's what those walls do. They don't just contain sound. They aim it. Imagine being part of a procession, moving through the temple complex, hearing chants shift as you pass different thresholds. Louder here, quieter there, voices appearing and disappearing, as if the building itself is alive. That would be unforgettable. That would reinforce belief at a visceral level. You wouldn't debate theology after that. You'd feel it in your bones. And this is where the mystery deepens, because we can't say with certainty how intentional all of this was. Some of it may be emergent, a byproduct of scale and geometry. But the line between intentional and emergent doesn't matter as much as we think. What matters is that it worked. It shaped experience. And experience is the core of ritual. So when people talk about the Karnak sound laser walls, what they're really talking about is a recognition that ancient spaces were multisensory technologies. They weren't just visual monuments. They were environments tuned to the human body. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The walls aren't silent. They're waiting. Waiting for vibration. Waiting for voice. Waiting for breath. They were built to listen as much as to speak. And that idea, that stone could be an active participant in ritual, not just a backdrop, might be one of the most sophisticated concepts of all. As you stand there, surrounded by columns, feeling your own voice behave differently than it does anywhere else, it's hard not to wonder how much of the ancient world was shaped by understandings we've dismissed because they don't fit neatly into our categories. Not science as we define it. Not superstition either. Something in between, something embodied. And once that door opens, you start asking new questions, not just about Karnak, but about every ancient site where sound, stone, and belief intersect. Because if Karnak could do this, deliberately or not, what else have we missed? What other walls are still holding vibrations we no longer know how to hear? That thought alone is enough to make you pause, lower your voice, and listen a little more carefully. Because once you start listening, instead of just looking, Karnak changes completely. It stops being a ruin and starts behaving like an instrument, a massive one, tuned not with strings or keys, but with corridors, pillars, open courts, and walls that stretch so far your brain struggles to register their edges. Sound becomes the thread that ties it all together. One of the most intriguing things about Karnak is how movement alters what you hear. Walk a few steps, and the acoustics shift. Turn a corner, and a voice that was clear suddenly dissolves. Step between two columns, and it sharpens again. That tells you the space wasn't neutral. It was active. And if you were an ancient priest who spent years inside this complex, you would know exactly where to stand, where to speak, and where to remain silent. Knowledge like that wouldn't need diagrams. It would live in muscle memory. This is where the idea of sound as authority really comes into focus. In a culture where gods were everywhere, unseen but present, the ability to make sound appear from stone would feel divine, not metaphorically divine, literally divine. If a chant rolls down a corridor and emerges amplified in a sacred chamber while the speaker remains hidden, the source of that voice becomes ambiguous. Is it a person, or is it the god inhabiting the temple? That ambiguity is the point. Modern people sometimes hear this and immediately think trick, like it's some kind of con, but that's a modern bias. For ancient cultures, there wasn't a sharp line between natural phenomena and divine action. If sound behaves a certain way in a sacred place, that behavior is sacred. The wall isn't tricking you, it's participating. There's also the issue of scale again. Karnak wasn't designed for individuals. It was designed for crowds, processions, mass participation. When hundreds of people are gathered, sound control becomes even more important. Without it, everything turns into chaos. But with long corridors, thick walls, and open courts positioned just right, sound can be layered. Drums in one space, chanting in another, silence in between. That kind of orchestration would turn ritual into something unforgettable. Think about how that would feel emotionally. You're walking with a crowd. The sun is blazing outside. Then you enter shadow. The temperature drops. The noise softens. A chant begins somewhere ahead, low and steady. It grows louder as you move forward, not because the chanters are closer, but because the walls are focusing the sound toward you. Your heart rate sinks. Your breath slows. You don't need theology at that point. Your body already believes. What makes the sound laser idea compelling isn't that the ancients were doing physics experiments. It's that they were shaping human experience with an intuitive grasp of how environments influence perception. We do the same thing today in concert halls, theaters, even shopping malls. We just use different language for it. Back then, the language was sacred. Another layer to this is time. Karnak wasn't static. It evolved, which means later builders experienced what earlier builders had created. They heard the acoustics, they felt the impact, and they chose to preserve it. That's important. If something didn't work, it wouldn't be replicated. The fact that these sound-conducive spaces weren't destroyed or radically altered suggests they were valued, respected, possibly essential. There's also something poetic about the idea that stone remembers sound. Physically, vibrations pass through it and fade. But culturally, they linger. The memory of how a space sounded becomes part of its identity. When rituals stopped, the sound stopped too, but the architecture remained, like a paused note waiting to be played again. That's why modern visitors sometimes feel like something is missing. The instrument is intact, but the music is gone. And yet, fragments of that music still surface, a footstep echoing longer than expected, a voice carrying farther than logic says it should. Those moments feel intimate, almost intrusive, like you've accidentally triggered something old, something that wasn't meant for you. That sensation alone can send people down rabbit holes of speculation. Some argue that we're overthinking it, that these effects are incidental, and maybe some of them are. But incidental doesn't mean insignificant. Evolution itself works through incidental effects that prove useful. Culture does the same. If an architectural feature creates awe, and awe reinforces belief, that feature survives. Intentional or not, it becomes part of the system. What's hard for modern minds is accepting that ancient people could operate comfortably in that gray zone, not needing to label something as science or religion, not needing to separate function from meaning. For them, if something worked, if it shaped experience in a way that aligned with their worldview, that was enough. The phrase laser walls might be modern, but the underlying intuition isn't. Focused energy has always fascinated humans. Fire, light, sound. Anything that can be concentrated feels powerful, dangerous, sacred. Karnak concentrates sound the way a lens concentrates light. And standing inside it, you feel that concentration whether you understand it or not. There's also an almost meditative aspect to it. Silence at Karnak isn't empty, it's dense. When sound does appear, it feels intentional by contrast. That kind of environment trains attention. You listen more carefully. You become aware of your own breath, your own voice. In a ritual context, that heightened awareness would make participants more receptive, more open to suggestion, more emotionally synchronized. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable idea of all, that ancient builders understood human psychology deeply enough to design spaces that guide emotional states, not through force, but through experience. If that's true, then places like Karnak weren't just temples. They were interfaces between individual and collective, between human and divine, between inner experience and outer structure. The walls didn't need to speak constantly. In fact, silence would make the moments of sound more impactful. A single chant after long quiet would feel monumental. A single word would feel heavy. That's the opposite of how we treat sound today, where it's constant and often meaningless. At Karnak, sound meant something because it was rare and controlled. It's also worth remembering that writing existed in ancient Egypt, but not everyone could read. Sound, on the other hand, reached everyone. It was inclusive, democratic in a strange way. You didn't need education to feel it. You just needed ears and a body. That makes sound the perfect medium for shared belief. So when people ask whether the Karnak sound laser walls were real, the answer depends on what you mean by real. Were there literal beams of sound slicing through space like sci-fi weapons? No. But were there architectural features that focused, directed, and amplified sound in ways that felt intentional and powerful? Almost certainly. And maybe the bigger point is this: the ancients didn't separate mystery from function the way we do. Mystery was part of the function. Feeling awe wasn't a side effect, it was the goal. Karnak wasn't trying to explain the universe. It was trying to make you feel it. Standing there today, surrounded by weathered stone and open sky, you're only seeing half the structure. The other half was invisible. Vibrations, voices, silence. That half is gone now, but traces remain, enough to hint at what once was, enough to make us question our assumptions. In the end, the Karnak sound laser walls aren't about proving ancient super technology or hidden knowledge. They're about recognizing that human ingenuity doesn't always look like machinery. Sometimes it looks like patience, observation, and a willingness to listen closely to how the world responds. If you slow down in places like Karnak, lower your voice, and let the space answer back, you start to understand why these sites endure in our imagination. Not because they give us answers, but because they remind us that experience itself can be a form of wisdom, and that long before we measured sound, we learned how to feel it.